The morning had started like any other at Kensington Palace. The staff moved quietly through the long corridors, voices kept low, footsteps careful on the polished stone floors. Outside, the early spring sky hung pale and gray over London, the kind of sky that couldn't decide whether to rain or let the sun through. Inside, the palace breathed with its usual rhythm, measured, composed, unhurried. Prince William was already awake before 6. He had always been an early riser, a habit carried over from years of military training that no amount of royal comfort had ever managed to shake. He dressed quietly, careful not to wake Kate, and walked down to the small private office on the ground floor that he used for personal matters, away from the formal study where official correspondence was handled. This room was different, smaller, warmer, lined with photographs and a few books that actually meant something to him. A place where he could think without feeling the weight of a crown pressing down on him. He had come down for a specific reason. 2 weeks earlier, a package had arrived, forwarded through the palace postal office. Marked private, hand-addressed in a handwriting he hadn't recognized. His private secretary had flagged it, held it through the usual security checks, and then quietly placed it on his desk with no further comment. William had seen it, had moved it aside more than once, and had somehow never found the moment to open it. Today, he told himself, he would deal with it. He sat down, pulled the package toward him, and looked at it properly for the first time. It was a padded envelope, brown, slightly worn at the corners as though it had been handled many times before being sent. His name was written on the front in careful, deliberate lettering, not formal, not official, but personal. The return address was a village in Norfolk he did not immediately recognize. He turned it over. Nothing on the back. No further explanation. He opened it carefully. Inside was a smaller envelope, sealed, and beneath it a folded letter written on plain white paper. He picked up the letter first. The handwriting was steady, but clearly that of someone elderly. The letters formed slowly, with great intention. He began to read. The letter was from a woman named Margaret Holloway. She was 81 years old. She introduced herself simply, without ceremony, and explained that she had been a junior household staff member at Kensington Palace for 3 years in the late 1980s, a period that covered the final years of Princess Diana's time living there before the separation. Margaret wrote that she had kept something for over 30 years. Not out of any desire for secrecy, she explained, but because she had never known what to do with it, and because the time had never seemed right. She had read recently that William had spoken publicly about missing his mother, about the gaps in what he knew of her private life. And that, Margaret wrote, was what had finally given her the courage to send this. William put the letter down. He sat very still for a moment. He had received many things over the years connected to his mother. Letters, photographs, tributes, objects. Each one carried its own particular weight. But something about the way this woman had written quietly, without wanting anything in return, with a kind of careful love, made him feel that what was inside the smaller, sealed envelope was going to be different. He picked it up. It was light. He broke the seal. Inside were 3 items. A small folded note in his mother's unmistakable handwriting. A photograph he had never seen before. And a pressed flower, dried and fragile, tucked between 2 pieces of thin card to protect it. He looked at the photograph first. It showed Diana sitting on the floor of what appeared to be a nursery, a room he recognized, with pale blue walls and a wooden rocking horse in the corner. She was sitting cross-legged, laughing at something just off camera, her hair loose around her shoulders. And in her lap, curled against her, fast asleep, was a small boy in a blue striped pajama top. William stared at the photograph for a long time. He could not have been more than 2 years old in it, maybe younger. He had never seen this photograph. Not in any archive, not in any book, not in any collection the family had ever shared with him. This was a moment that had existed only in the memory of whoever had held the camera, and now here it was. Given back to him across 30 years, his hand was not entirely steady when he set it down. He unfolded the small note next. It was brief, only a few lines. Diana had written it in her quick, slanted hand. The kind of writing she used for personal things rather than formal correspondence. The note was not addressed to anyone specifically. It read more like a thought she had written down for herself, something she hadn't wanted to forget. It spoke about a particular afternoon, a rainy day, a sleeping child. A feeling she described simply as the most peaceful she had known in a long time. She wrote that she wanted to remember it exactly as it was, that she didn't want the noise of everything else to take it away from her. William read it twice. Then he read it a third time. He was not a man who cried easily. Years of public life had built a composure in him that was real, not performed a genuine steadiness that he had worked hard to develop. But sitting alone in that small, warm office, holding a note his mother had written about a quiet afternoon with him when he was barely old enough to walk, he felt something move through him that had no easy name. Not grief exactly. Not just grief. Something older than grief. Something that felt like being handed back a piece of yourself you hadn't known was missing. He sat with it for a long time. He didn't hear Kate come down the stairs. He didn't hear her pause at the doorway. He didn't hear her soft voice say his name once, then again, more gently. When he didn't respond, it was only when she crossed the room and placed her hand on his shoulder that he came back to where he was. He looked up at her, and Kate, who knew him better than anyone on earth, who could read every shift in his face before he had found words for it. Kate looked at what was spread across the desk in front of him, and at the expression on his face, and she said nothing at all. She simply pulled the chair beside him close, sat down, and waited. Because she understood, without being told, that what had just happened in this room was something that needed to be held gently, and that whatever it was, he would tell her when he was ready. Kate did not rush him. That was one of the things William had always loved most about her, the way she understood that silence was not emptiness. That sometimes the most caring thing a person could do was simply stay, without filling the air with words. She sat beside him in the small office, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the desk near his. She let him find his own way back to the surface. It took a few minutes. He took a breath, long and slow, and then he looked at her properly. Her eyes were soft, watchful, carrying that particular quality of attention she reserved for the moments that truly mattered. She hadn't glanced at the items on the desk. She was looking at him. He told her about the letter first. About Margaret Holloway, the 81-year-old woman from Norfolk, who had spent 3 years working in this very palace in the late 80s and had carried something with her all that time. He explained how the package had sat on his desk, untouched, for 2 weeks. How he hadn't been able to explain even to himself why he kept putting it aside. Kate listened without interrupting. She nodded once, slowly, as he described opening the outer envelope, and finding the careful handwriting of an elderly woman who had wanted nothing in return, only to give something back that she felt didn't belong to her. Then he slid the photograph across the desk. Toward her, Kate looked at it. She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant she was taking something in fully before she allowed herself to respond. She studied the pale blue walls of the nursery, the wooden rocking horse, the loose hair, the laugh caught mid-breath, and the small boy in the blue-striped pajamas completely surrendered to sleep, curled against his mother as if the whole world beyond that moment simply didn't exist. "You've never seen this before," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Ever," he said. She looked at it a little longer. "She looks so happy," she said quietly, not posed. Just completely happy. That was exactly it. That was the thing he hadn't yet found words for. It wasn't a formal photograph. Wasn't a portrait. Wasn't the kind of image that ended up in archives or newspapers. It was a private moment, stolen gently by whoever had held the camera, and Diana in it was entirely herself. No performance, no awareness of being watched, just a young mother on a rainy afternoon, holding her sleeping son and laughing at something off to the side, and looking, as Kate had said, completely happy. William nodded. He passed the folded note across next. He watched Kate read it. He saw the moment she reached the part about the rainy day, the sleeping child, the feeling his mother had described as the most peaceful she had known in a long time. He saw Kate's expression shift, not dramatically, not into tears, but into something very still and very tender. Her fingers held the paper carefully, as if she understood that it was fragile in more ways than one. She set it down gently and looked at him. She wrote it for herself, Kate said. She wasn't writing it for anyone to read. She just wanted to keep it, as William said. There was a long pause between them. Outside, a bird moved past the window. The pale gray sky had started to lighten almost imperceptibly at its edges. She kept that afternoon, Kate said softly. In her own words, and now you have it. He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. She had said exactly the right thing, the thing he had been circling without landing on since. He had first read the note an hour ago. His mother had wanted to protect that memory, had written it down so the noise of everything else couldn't take it from her. And somehow, through the quiet loyalty of a woman he had never met, that small act of preservation had survived, had found its way to him across more than 30 years. He picked up the pressed flower next. It was small, a pale violet, the kind that grew easily in English gardens in spring. It had been dried and pressed with care, tucked between thin pieces of card so that it held its shape. Margaret's letter had not explained it specifically, only mentioned that it had been found tucked inside a book in the nursery after Diana had left the palace, and that Margaret had kept it without knowing exactly why. Perhaps because it seemed wrong to throw away something that had obviously been placed there deliberately. Kate leaned forward slightly to look at it. Do you know what kind it is? William asked. A violet, she said. She loved violets. There's a photograph of her at Highgrove once. You can see them in the background of the garden. She might have pressed it herself. He hadn't known that. About the violets. That small detail. The kind of detail that should have been ordinary. It's the kind of thing a son simply knows about his mother, landed with a particular ache. There were so many of those details missing. So many ordinary things he hadn't been old enough to learn before she was gone. A favorite flower. A habit. A preference. The small private architecture of a person's life. Kate seemed to understand what he was thinking. She reached across and covered his hand with hers. You have more of her than you know, she said. George has her laugh. Charlotte has her eyes. Louis has that way of looking at a room like he's already decided he owns it. She smiled just slightly. She's not gone. She's just distributed. She's in all of you. He looked at her. Something in him that had been tightly wound since he sat down that morning loosened slightly. Not all the way. Not entirely. But enough to breathe more easily. He thought about George. 8 years old and already showing a dry, unexpected humor that seemed to come from nowhere obvious. He thought about Charlotte, fiercely confident, warm-hearted, already showing a gift for reading people that was striking in a child her age. He thought about Louis, who treated the world as an adventure he had personally been invited to lead. Diana in all of them, just as Kate said. Not a ghost, but a living thread. I want to write to Margaret, he said after a while. Properly. Not through the office. Kate nodded. Of course, she kept this for 30 years. She could have done anything with it. She didn't. He looked at the photograph again. She just held onto it until she felt it was the right time to give it back. Some people are like that, Kate said. They carry things for other people without being asked. He looked at her when she said that, and she met his eyes, and there was a warmth between them in that small room that needed no commentary. She had been that person for him, in her own way, for more than 20 years. The one who held things steady. The one who stayed. He gathered the items carefully. The note, the photograph, the pressed flower, and held them together in his hands for a moment. 3 small things. Light as paper and petals. And yet they held the weight of an afternoon he had never known he was part of. A memory his mother had wanted to keep. A flower pressed by hands that had held him when he was too young to remember. He was going to find the right way to preserve them. Not in a palace archive. Not in any official collection. Somewhere private. Somewhere that belonged only to him and, in time, to his children. But first, he was going to sit here a little longer, in this small, warm room, with the morning light slowly strengthening outside the window, and the woman beside him who had known without being told that this was something he needed to face quietly and not alone. By mid-morning, The palace had woken fully around them. The children were up. They could hear Louis making some kind of announcement at the top of his voice somewhere upstairs, followed by what sounded like Charlotte firmly disagreeing with him, and then a burst of laughter from George that suggested whatever Louis had done was funnier than Charlotte wanted to admit. The ordinary sound of a family mourning was bright and loud and wonderfully unceremonious. William and Kate had eventually left the small office, moving together back into the rhythm of the day. Breakfast was handled. A member of staff spoke briefly with Kate about the week's schedule, and William took a call from his private secretary about a visit he was preparing for later in the week. The items from the envelope had been placed carefully in the top drawer of his desk, wrapped again in the card Margaret had used to protect the pressed flower. He hadn't put them out of his mind. He simply carried them with him, folded into the day. But through the morning, Kate noticed something in him. It was subtle. He was functioning entirely normally, present in every conversation, patient with the children, focused on the call. And yet there was a quality of reflection underneath it all. The way a river runs differently after heavy rain, even when the surface looks calm. She knew the signs. She had learned them over years. William processed things inwardly at his own pace, and the processing could take time. What he had held in his hands that morning was not something that could be set aside after an hour. After lunch, when Louis had been persuaded to rest, and Charlotte had settled quietly with a book and George had disappeared to the garden with a football, Kate found William standing at the tall window of the sitting room that overlooked the private garden. He had a cup of tea in his hand that had clearly gone cold. He was looking at the garden without really seeing it. She stood beside him. She didn't say anything immediately. After a moment, he said, "I keep thinking about what she must have been feeling when she wrote that note." Kate waited. "She was living in the middle of everything falling apart," he said. "Everything between her and my father, it was already breaking by then. There were people everywhere, all the time. The public, the press, the demands, the whole weight of the institution pushing down on her every single day." He paused, and she sat on the floor of that nursery on a rainy afternoon with a sleeping child in her lap and found peace in it. Enough peace to want to write it down. "That's what mothers do," Kate said gently. "The world can be completely overwhelming, and you still find those moments. You hold on to them because they're real in a way that nothing else feels real." He looked at her. "Did you ever?" "Yes," she said simply. Before he could finish, many times. When George was very small, and I was still finding my feet in all of this, there were days I felt completely lost. And then he'd fall asleep on me, and everything else just fell away. Just for a little while. She smiled. "You forget every hard thing. You just exist in the quiet." He nodded slowly. "She found that in me," he said, "on that particular afternoon, and she wanted to keep it." He turned back to the window. She didn't keep it for anyone else to see. She kept it for herself, because it belonged to her. There was something important in that, Kate knew. For William, who had grown up watching so much of his mother's life become public property, dissected and discussed and displayed the idea that Diana had possessed private moments, real ones, ones that had never been taken from her, mattered enormously. The note was proof of that. The photograph was proof of that. She had had a life that was hers. Parts of herself that she had kept, and now one of those parts had found its way home. "She would have wanted you to have it," Kate said. "She would have wanted you to know about that afternoon." He was quiet for a moment. Margaret said in her letter that she hoped it brought more comfort than pain. He almost smiled. "It does both, but mostly comfort." Kate took the cold cup of tea from his hand, set it on the small table nearby, and replaced it with her own hand. He looked down at it, then up at her. "I want to take the children somewhere this weekend," he said. "Somewhere quiet. No schedule." "Yes," she said. "Somewhere with a garden. Somewhere they can just be loud and ridiculous and not think about anything." "I'll arrange it," she said. "Not Anmer," he said. "Somewhere new. Somewhere none of us have been before."
Oh.
She looked at him, slightly curious. "I want a new afternoon," he said. And the way he said it was simple and clear. "A rainy afternoon, if the weather cooperates." I want to sit on the floor with them and do something completely pointless and be completely at peace, and then remember it. The way she did. Kate looked at him for a long time. Something moved through her, a feeling too layered to name quickly. Love, certainly. Admiration, a kind of ache for the boy he had been. Sleeping in his mother's lap in a pale blue nursery, while she laughed at something off camera and felt, for one quiet afternoon, entirely at peace. And a feeling of profound gratitude that he was here, that she was here beside him, that their children were laughing somewhere in this building, that the thread Diana had hoped to preserve had held. She would have loved them so much, Kate said. Her voice was steady, but only just. Yes, William said. There was no hesitation in it. She would have been completely ridiculous with Louis. She would have let him get away with everything. He did smile this time properly. Charlotte would have adored her. And George? He stopped. George would have understood her, I think. In the way that's hard to explain. He has her instinct for people, Kate agreed. He sees things. He does. William looked back out at the garden. George was still out there with the football, attempting something ambitious near the far hedge and failing spectacularly. Then immediately setting himself up to try again. Resilient, cheerful, utterly unbothered by failure. She would have watched him out this very window, William said quietly, and she would have wanted to write it down. Kate leaned her head against his shoulder very briefly. Just for a moment. Then she straightened. Write to Margaret today, she said. Don't wait. I will, he said, and he meant it. Not the formal acknowledgement that would eventually go through the office, but the real letter, the one he would write himself by hand on plain paper, the one that would try to say what it meant to have something returned to you that you hadn't known you were missing, the one that would tell an 81-year-old woman in Norfolk that what she had carried for 30 years had landed exactly where it was meant to go, and that it had done what she had hoped it would do. That afternoon, before the day's last demands arrived, he sat down and he wrote it. The letter to Margaret Holloway took William longer to write than he had expected. He had sat down with a clear idea of what he wanted to say, a simple, sincere expression of thanks, and then found that the words kept expanding beyond that. There was so much more to say. Not in an excessive way. Not in a way that would overwhelm an elderly woman who had done something quietly generous and asked for nothing. But in an honest way. The truth was that what she had sent him had opened something, and he didn't want to pretend otherwise. He wrote and rewrote 3 times before settling on a version that felt right. He thanked her without overcrowding his words with sentiment. He told her what the photograph had meant, that he had never seen it. It was now something he would keep privately for the rest of his life. He mentioned the pressed violet, told her what Kate had told him about his mother's love for that particular flower, and said that knowing Margaret had preserved it carefully for all these years had moved him more than he could easily express. He said that the note, his mother's own words about that afternoon, had given him something that no official archive or public tribute ever could. The sound of her voice, speaking to no one but herself, in a moment of genuine peace. He sealed the letter himself. He addressed it himself. And the following morning, he gave it to his private secretary with specific instructions that it was to be sent directly. Not through the palace postal chain, a personal letter. Treated as such. That same week, Kate quietly made arrangements for the weekend. She found a small private estate in the countryside, less than 2 hours from London, that could be arranged discreetly. It had a large garden, open fields, no formal rooms to impress anyone, just a comfortable, rambling old house with worn carpets and deep sofas, and a kitchen that smelled of wood and old stone. The kind of place that had no interest in being impressive. The kind of place where a family could simply exist. She didn't tell the children where they were going until the morning they left. Louis immediately demanded to know if there would be animals. George asked whether there was space for football. Charlotte, with characteristic practicality, asked whether there was a bath big enough to actually lie down in. Kate told them yes to all 3, somewhat optimistically, and loaded everyone into the car. Before further questions could be asked, the drive down was noisy and cheerful in the way that long car journeys with 3 children always were, a shifting mixture of games. Complaints, arguments about nothing. Louis falling asleep for exactly 11 minutes and then waking up as if electrified. Charlotte reading a book with stern concentration while still managing to participate in every conversation around her. George pointing out things through the window with the running commentary of someone who had decided narrating the countryside was his personal responsibility. William drove. Kate sat beside him, maps on her phone, fielding questions from the back. Somewhere past the motorway and into the quieter roads, he reached across and briefly squeezed her hand. She looked at him. He was looking at the road, but he was smiling quietly to himself. The smile of someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be. The house was everything Kate had hoped. The children tumbled out of the car and immediately began establishing territory, Louis making straight for the garden as if drawn by magnetism. Charlotte walking through the front door with the studied interest of a surveyor. George finding the football pitch equivalents in the open field behind the house within approximately 90 seconds. William stood at the entrance to the garden and looked at it all with an expression that Kate had come to know as his most private happiness. Not the formal smile, not the composed public face, just a man standing still, watching his children be loud and free. The rain arrived on Saturday afternoon. It came in gently at first, a soft, persistent rain, the kind that turns the garden dark green and makes the air smell of earth and wet stone. The children, to Kate's mild surprise, showed no particular objection to it. Louis decided immediately that rain was better than no rain and went directly outside without being asked or told. Returning within 4 minutes, soaked through and enormously pleased with himself. Charlotte found a position on the covered porch where she could watch the garden and still stay dry, which seemed to satisfy her completely. George lasted approximately 8 minutes longer than Louis outside before coming in equally drenched and looking equally satisfied after. The children were changed into dry clothes and given hot chocolate. That required more negotiation than it should have. They gathered in the large sitting room. No screens, no schedule, no particular plan. Louis had found a set of building blocks somewhere in a cupboard and was constructing something that he insisted was an airport, though it bore no visible resemblance to one. Charlotte had brought her book, but had set it face down on her knee and was watching her brothers with the fond exasperation she had perfected at an early age. George was lying on the rug on his stomach, chin resting on his hands, watching Louis's airport take increasingly questionable shape and clearly deciding whether it was worth offering architectural advice. William sat on the floor with his back against the sofa. Kate came and sat beside him, close, their shoulders touching. The fire was on. The rain moved softly against the windows. Outside, the garden had gone quiet and gray and gentle. Louis looked up from his construction. "Papa, can you help?" He held out a block. "What are you building?" William asked, moving forward to join him on the rug. "An airport," Louis said, with great patience, as if this should have been obvious. "Right," William said. "Where does this go?" "There," Louis said firmly, pointing at a location that made no structural sense whatsoever. "Perfect," William said, and placed the block exactly where he had been told. Charlotte looked up from her book with an expression, suggesting she had many thoughts about this. George rolled over onto his back and looked at the ceiling. Kate watched all of them from where she sat, this ordinary, extraordinary scene, and felt something settle deep inside her. The rain outside, the fire, the blocks going up in their impossible arrangement. William on the floor, entirely present, helping Louis build an airport that would never stand up. She thought about a woman in a pale blue nursery, sitting cross-legged on the floor, a sleeping boy in her lap, laughing at something off camera and feeling, for one quiet afternoon, completely at peace. She understood it now in a way she hadn't fully before. Not as an abstract thing, not as history. She understood it from the inside, the way you can only understand something when you are living it yourself. The noise of the world fell away. The weight of everything complicated and demanding and public simply did not exist in this room. There was only this: the rain, the fire, the blocks, the children. William on the rug. She took out her phone quietly. She held it up. And she took a photograph, not posed. Not for any public purpose. Not for anyone but them. William didn't notice. He was deep in earnest consultation with Louis about the structural challenges of Terminal 2. Charlotte had given up resisting and moved down to the floor to join them. George was now building something adjacent to the airport that he claimed was a hotel, but which Louis immediately disputed jurisdiction over. Kate looked at the photograph on her screen. William on the floor, turned slightly away, the children around him, the fire behind them all. The rainy window in the background. She looked at it for a long moment, then she opened the notes app on her phone, and she wrote a single sentence. About a rainy afternoon? About the feeling. About wanting to remember it exactly as it was? She pressed save, and she sat in the warmth and watched her family. She kept it. 3 weeks after the weekend in the countryside, a letter arrived at Kensington Palace addressed to William in an elderly woman's careful handwriting. It was a reply from Margaret Holloway. He opened it at his desk in the small, private office, the same room where this had all begun. The morning was bright this time, proper spring having finally arrived, and pale gold light came through the window and lay across the desk in long, warm bars. He unfolded the letter and read it slowly. Margaret wrote that she had read his letter many times since receiving it. She said she had been afraid when she sent the package that it might cause pain rather than comfort, and that his words had put that fear to rest entirely. She told him she was glad she had waited until the time felt right. She said that she had thought of his mother often over the years, not in a grand way, not in the way the public did, but in the small personal way that comes from having worked alongside someone, having observed their ordinary moments, having watched them move through a day. She said Diana had been kind to the junior staff in a way that was not performance. She had simply seen people and treated them accordingly. Margaret had never forgotten that. She wrote that after she received William's letter, she had gone to find something she'd kept for herself, a photograph she had taken on a separate occasion. One she had never considered sending because it had seemed too small, too ordinary to be of interest. But reading his words had changed her mind. She had enclosed it. William reached into the envelope. He found a second photograph, smaller than the first, slightly older in its coloring. It showed Diana from behind, standing at a nursery window, looking out at a garden. She was holding a very small infant against her shoulder, no more than a few months old. Wrapped in white, one tiny fist just visible near her collarbone. Diana's posture was completely relaxed, one hand supporting the baby, the other resting lightly on the window frame. She was looking out at something. The light came from outside and caught the side of her face in profile. She didn't know she was being photographed. William turned the photograph over. On the back, Margaret had written in pencil, "I always thought she looked most like herself." When she was just being a mother, he set it down carefully on the desk. He sat with it for a long time. Later that day, he showed Kate. He didn't say much when he handed it to her. He just passed her the photograph and the note on the back. She held it in both hands. She looked at the image, Diana at the window, the baby against her shoulder, the light from outside, the garden beyond. And she read the words Margaret had written on the back. Kate didn't speak immediately. She turned the photograph over once, looked at it again from the front, and then set it down with the same care she had used with everything else connected to this strange and tender thread of weeks. When she looked up at William, her eyes were bright but steady. She was right, Kate said. That is when she looked most like herself. He nodded. You should show the children, Kate said. Not all of it. Not all at once. But eventually, when the time is right, they should know about Margaret. They should know someone kept these things for 30 years because they mattered and because they belonged to you. He had already been thinking the same thing. There were questions the children asked about Diana with growing frequency now, George in particular, who had reached an age of genuine curiosity, the kind that went past the general and started reaching for the specific. What was she like? What made her laugh? What did she care about? Questions that William answered as honestly and as fully as he could, drawing on memory, on what other people had told him, on the small accumulated details of a life he had known too briefly and had spent decades trying to understand more completely. These photographs were now part of that. These two images, one of Diana laughing on a nursery floor with a sleeping toddler, one of Diana at a window holding a newborn, completely unaware of being seen, were the most honest portraits of his mother he had ever possessed. Not staged, not official, not managed. Just a woman being a mother. Caught in the act by someone who loved her quietly and kept what they saw. He was going to have both photographs framed. Not for any public display, not for any palace wall. For his private study, the small personal room where none of it had to perform. Where they could simply exist as what they were. Evidence of a life lived genuinely. In between all the difficulty and the noise. By a woman who had found her best self in the ordinary moments, he was also going to write to Margaret again. He had already decided. A longer letter this time, telling her about the weekend in the countryside, the rain, fire, the children on the floor, the impossible airport, Kate's photograph, and her note on her phone. He wanted Margaret to know that the thread she had kept alive had extended itself. That the afternoon his mother had written about in her own words had, in some quiet way, been lived again. He thought about the pressed violet, now sitting in a small glass frame on his desk. Such a fragile thing to have survived so long. A flower picked, possibly from the Kensington garden, possibly from somewhere else entirely, pressed with care. Tucked inside a book, found by someone who understood instinctively that it shouldn't be thrown away. Kept for 30 years in a drawer in Norfolk, and now here, on his desk, in the spring light, still holding its shape, that was what he kept coming back to. The holding of shape, the things that survived not because they were protected by institutions or recorded in archives, but because individual people, moved by something they couldn't fully explain, decided quietly that a particular thing mattered and should not be lost. Margaret had done that. For 30 years. Without being asked, without recognition, without knowing if there would ever be a right moment to give it back, or if the right moment would ever come. And then one morning, reading something William had said publicly about his mother, she had understood that the time was now, that the person who needed these things was ready to receive them. He would never stop being grateful for that. For the particular kind of courage it took to do something small and quiet and true, and to trust that it would find its way to where it needed to go. That evening. After the children were in bed, William and Kate sat together in the sitting room. The lights were low. The house was quiet in the way it only went when the children were finally genuinely asleep. They weren't talking about anything important the week ahead. Something one of the children had said at dinner that had made them both laugh. A book Kate was reading. Ordinary things. The texture of an ordinary evening. At some point, William reached over and took Kate's hand. He didn't say anything. He just held it. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the middle distance, not troubled, not sad, just thinking. The way he looked when something had settled inside him that had previously been unsettled. She had seen it before, and she knew what it meant. It meant he was at peace with something. She knew, he said after a while, quietly, without preamble. She knew what mattered. In the middle of everything, all the chaos, all the pain, she knew. A rainy afternoon, a sleeping child. That's what she wrote down. That's what she wanted to keep. Kate said nothing. She just held his hand. I think about that, he said. I want to be like that. I want to know what matters. You do, Kate? Said simply. You already do. He looked at her. And the expression on his face, open, steady, entirely without guard, was one she would keep in her own memory for the rest of her life. Not photographed. Not written down. Just held the way Diana had held that quiet afternoon, the way Margaret had held a violet and a photograph and a folded note for 30 years. Some things didn't need to be preserved in any formal way. Some things just needed to be lived and felt and carried gently forward. That was enough. That had always been enough.